Now we're going to start looking at methods for graphing, and one of the methods we're going to look at is dealing with intercepts. The x-intercept occurs when a graph crosses the x-axis, and the y-intercept occurs where a graph crosses the y-axis. The graph of x equals a is going to be a vertical line, and the graph of y equals b is going to be a horizontal line, and we're going to see examples of that in this lesson. So for this particular line, it says find the intercepts of a linear equation and graph using the intercepts. Well, the intercepts are going to be where they cross the line. So find the coordinates of the intercepts. Well, the x, let's see here, the coordinates of the y-intercept, they want us to do the y-intercept first. So the y-intercept is going to be where it crosses the y-axis. So the y-intercept is going to be, that location is 0, 3. The x-intercept is going to be where it crosses the x-axis, and that's going to be at 2, 0. And what you'll notice is the intercepts lie on the axes, and whenever a point is on an axis, the number 0 is always involved. So it just depends on which axis that you're on. So all y-intercepts will have a value in the y-coordinate, but 0 for the x. And vice versa, all x-intercepts will have a value in the x-coordinate, but it'll have 0 for your y-coordinate. And we're going to use that idea eventually to help us graph. So in order to help us graph, then we would start with an equation and we would find those points. And we're going to do that by finding what I like to call zeros. So it's similar to what we were doing before, but instead of picking any values, we're going to pick very specific values. So I want to pick 0 for x, that's going to give me a y-intercept. And then I'm going to pick 0 for y, and that's going to give me an x-intercept. So let's find the y-intercept first. So I'm going to plug in 0 for my x and solve for y. If you're looking for your y-intercept, then you're going to be solving for y. 6 times 0 is 0, so I'm left with 5y equals 30. And I would divide both sides by 5. And that means y equals 6. So my y-intercept is 0, 6. Now I'm going to find my other intercept. So it's going to be my x-intercept, which means I plug in 0 for y. So I'm going to have 6x plus 0, because 5 times 0 is 0. Divide by 6, so x equals 5. So when I plug in 0 for y, I get 5 for 0. So my x-coordinate is 5, 0. So if I was graphing, I've got two ordered pairs ready to go for graphing. So when you are going to find intercepts, you find two ordered pairs by plugging in zeros. We could turn around then and use those points to help us graph. But right now we're just practicing finding the intercepts. So we'll skip this one. And let's find the intercepts for number 9. So again, I'm going to plug in 0 for x, so I'm going to have negative 3 times 0 plus 2y equals 5. That's going to give me 0 plus 2y, so 2y equals 5. Divide by 2, so y equals 5 halves. So when I plug in 0, I get 5 halves. So my y-intercept is 0, 5 halves. And now let's find our other intercept by plugging in 0 for y. Yes, for y. So I'm going to have negative 3x plus 2 times 0 equals 5. So that's going to give me negative 3x. 2 times 0 is 0. Divide by negative 3. and that's going to give me negative 5/3. So negative 5/3, 0 would be my x-intercept. Now we're going to put all the pieces together. We're going to find intercepts, and then we're going to turn around and graph our equation. So if I'm going to find my y-intercept first, so I'm going to plug in 0 for x. So it's going to give me 0 plus 2y equals 4. So that's 2y equals 4. Divide by 2. So y equals 2. So when I plug in 0, I get 2. So my y-intercept is 0, 2. Now I'm going to find my x-intercept. So it'll be x plus 2 times 0 equals 4, because now I'm plugging in 0 for y, and that's going to be x plus 0, which is just x, and x equals 4. So when I plug in 0 for y, I get 4 for x. So 4, 0. So now when I graph those points, 0, 2, 4, 0, and now I'm going to draw my line. And put my arrows on the end. And there's my line. So that's how you can use intercepts to help you graph. It's just a modified version of what I call point plotting, like what we were doing before, where we just pick whatever values we want for x to find the y's. This, we're just making it more specific. We're plugging in zeros, 0 for x, solving, and then plugging in 0 for y and solving. So now let's look at these two graphs, because these equations look very, very different from what we've been doing. Both of these equations only have one variable. And so what that means is they're actually the easiest to graph, but they're the hardest to kind of wrap your brain around. So when you're missing a variable like this, you're either going to have a horizontal line or a vertical line, because when you have the two variables, that's going to give you the slant. If you only have one variable, like I said, it's horizontal or vertical. The question is, how do you know when it's horizontal and how do you know when it's vertical? And the question you ask yourself is, like in number 17, if x equals negative 3, that means it has to cross the x-axis. So the x-axis is your horizontal axis. And so if we're crossing that, then that means that we have a vertical line at negative 3. In other words, if it's x equals, it has an x-intercept. Opposite of that, if it's y equals, then it has to cross the y-axis, which means it must be a horizontal line at 4. So again, these are the easiest to graph because there's no work involved. You just have to remember which is which. So if it's y equals, it crosses the y-axis. If it's x equals, it crosses the x-axis. And that's the easiest way to remember the two different types. So now this one's kind of a trick question, because at first you think it might be a slanted line, but if you look at the equation closer, you'll notice there's only one variable, which means it's either vertical or horizontal. So the question is, how do you graph it? Well, what you're going to want to do is isolate that variable, solve for that variable. So if we have 3x minus 15 equals 0, I need to solve the equation for x. So that's going to be 3x equals 15, divide by 3, so x equals 5. So what that means is I have an x equals 5 equation. That means I have an x-intercept, which means it has to cross the x-axis at 5. So that means I have a vertical line at 5, because it has an x-intercept, it's crossing the x-axis. So again, if there's only one variable, solve for it, and then decide if it's a vertical line or a horizontal line. Now here is a situation where they're giving us the lines and we have to write the equations. So in the first one, it's a vertical line. Well, look at where it's crossing. Is it crossing the x-axis or the y-axis? Well, it's crossing the x-axis, and it's crossing at -2. Look at the one on the bottom. Is it crossing the x or the y? This one's crossing the y at 3. So those are your equations. They look like answers to equations, but they're actually equations themselves. Anything with an equal sign is an equation.